Today, the Department of Justice and State Department are announcing a historic $50 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro.
When Maduro rallied his forces against what he referred to as American aggression, he never would have anticipated the response from the U.S. Army. As if a $50 million bounty on him wasn't bad enough, the latest action from Trump's military is even more jaw-dropping. Here's the exclusive: the chilling video that broke records. When you think about the largest bounties ever placed on human heads in American history, certain names immediately come to mind. Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein. These were the most wanted men on earth, and the United States government offered unprecedented sums for information leading to their capture or elimination. But what if I told you that in August 2025, the US government shattered every previous bounty record for a single individual, offering more money than they ever did for any terrorist leader in history? The target wasn't hiding in caves in Afghanistan or ruling from a bunker in Iraq. He was sitting in a presidential palace in Caracas, Venezuela, running what the United States now considers one of the most dangerous narco-terrorist operations on the planet. His name is Nicolas Maduro, and the bounty on his head just reached a staggering $50 million, the highest reward ever offered by the United States government for any individual. But this wasn't just another diplomatic announcement buried in the back pages of newspapers. This was delivered in what many are calling a chilling video that sent shockwaves through Venezuela and across the international community. The woman delivering this record-breaking ultimatum was none other than U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi, speaking directly into the camera with the kind of steely determination usually reserved for wartime addresses. In her video announcement, posted across social media platforms and broadcast around the world, Bondi accused Maduro of being one of the largest narco-traffickers in the world and a threat to our national security, declaring that under President Trump's leadership, Maduro will not escape justice and he will be held accountable for his despicable crimes. To understand just how unprecedented this moment truly is, we need to put this bounty into historical perspective. When the United States placed a bounty on Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the September 11th attacks, they offered $25 million. When they wanted Saddam Hussein, the dictator who had invaded Kuwait and defied international law, for over a decade they offered $25 million. These were men who had declared war on America, who had killed thousands of American citizens, who represented existential threats to U.S. interests around the globe. And yet, Nicolas Maduro, a man who has never directly attacked American soil, who has never orchestrated terrorist attacks against U.S. citizens, now has a bounty that is double what was offered for those notorious figures. This isn't just about money. It's about sending a message that reverberates far beyond the borders of Venezuela. The journey to this $50 million bounty didn't happen overnight. It represents an escalating campaign of pressure that has been building for years. The reward for Maduro began at $15 million in March 2020, following his indictment on narco-terrorism charges. In January 2025, under the Biden administration, it was raised to $25 million, framed as a show of solidarity with the Venezuelan opposition. Now, just months into the Trump administration's second term, it has doubled again. But what makes this particular announcement so chilling isn't just the astronomical sum, it's the allegations that come with it. According to the Department of Justice, Maduro isn't just running a country, he's running what they describe as a criminal enterprise that spans continents. The U.S. government alleges that Maduro has collaborated with major criminal organizations, including the Tren de Aragua, the Sinaloa Cartel, and the Venezuelan Cartel de los Soles, to traffic fentanyl-laced cocaine into the United States. The scope of these alleged operations is staggering. According to U.S. officials, they have seized more than $700 million in assets tied to Maduro, including private jets, luxury vehicles, and enormous quantities of narcotics. To put this in perspective, the U.S. government claims to have confiscated more money from this one man than many small countries generate in their entire annual GDP. But the real shock came in the details of what the U.S. government claims to have already accomplished in their campaign against Maduro. Beyond the $700 million in seized assets, they report having intercepted what they describe as tons of cocaine linked to Maduro's alleged criminal network. Some reports suggest the total amount of cocaine linked to Maduro and his associates reaches 30 tons. To understand what 30 tons of cocaine represents, consider this. That's enough drugs to supply every cocaine user in North America for months. It's an industrial-scale operation that goes far beyond what anyone might consider typical government corruption. According to the U.S. allegations, this isn't just about a leader skimming money from state resources. This is about transforming an entire nation into a narco-state. The timing of Bondi's video announcement was also strategically significant. It came at a moment when Venezuela was already facing unprecedented internal pressure. The country's economy had collapsed to the point where Venezuela ranks 178th out of 180 countries on global misery indexes, with over 80% of the population living below the poverty line and 54% living in extreme poverty. Inflation in Venezuela is running at over 770%, making basic necessities unaffordable for ordinary citizens.
Yeah, there's only a couple
Zimbabwe
countries
and Sudan.
Yeah, it is you know what their inflation is? Here we're talking about inflation being what? What's the number we're trying to keep it below?
Below
2% a year.
3%.
Do you know what inflation is in Venezuela right now? 70+%.
Wow.
It was 500%. It's at 70+%.
This is the context in which Bondi's video landed like a bombshell. Here was a country already on its knees economically, with citizens fleeing by the millions, and now the world's most powerful nation was essentially declaring open season on their president with the largest bounty in human history. The international reaction to this video was swift and polarized. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Ivan Gil immediately condemned the reward, calling it a crude political propaganda operation and a smokescreen. But the dismissive response from Caracas couldn't hide what many observers saw as genuine concern about the unprecedented escalation. What made this situation even more complex was the involvement of multiple U.S. government agencies in the announcement. This wasn't just the Justice Department acting alone. Both the Department of Justice and the State Department jointly announced the bounty increase, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio emphasizing that Maduro had led the Cartel de los Soles for over a decade. This coordinated approach suggested that the $50 million bounty wasn't an impulsive decision, but rather part of a carefully planned strategy involving the highest levels of the U.S. government. The video also revealed something crucial about how the United States views the current global landscape. By placing such an enormous bounty on Maduro, larger than any terrorist leader in history, the U.S. government was essentially declaring that narco-terrorism represented as significant a threat to American national security as traditional terrorism. This represented a fundamental shift in how America prioritizes its threats and allocates its resources. This skepticism would prove to be premature. The Trump administration was about to demonstrate that they weren't just engaging in rhetorical warfare. They were prepared to back up Attorney General Bondi's chilling video with the full might of the United States military. What happened next would transform this from a war of words into a genuine military crisis that brought two nations to the brink of armed conflict. Warships, militias, and the brink of war. If Attorney General Pam Bondi's $50 million bounty video was designed to send a message, President Maduro's response demonstrated that the message had been received loud and clear. But rather than cowering in fear or seeking diplomatic solutions, the Venezuelan leader chose to escalate the situation in ways that no one could have predicted. What followed was a military mobilization on both sides that transformed the Caribbean into a potential theater of war. Just days after Bondi's chilling video announcement, the United States government made a decision that sent shockwaves throughout Latin America and beyond. On August 18, 2025, the U.S. deployed 3 Aegis-guided missile destroyers, the USS Gravely, USS Jason Dunham, and USS Sampson, to the southern Caribbean, supported by 4,000 sailors and Marines, surveillance aircraft, and possibly a submarine. To understand the significance of this deployment, you need to understand what Aegis-class destroyers represent in terms of naval power projection. These aren't just ships. They're floating fortresses equipped with some of the most advanced weapon systems on Earth. Each destroyer carries dozens of guided missiles capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away with pinpoint accuracy. The fact that the United States deployed not 1, but 3 of these vessels, along with thousands of military personnel, sent an unmistakable message. This was no longer just about bounties and rhetoric. The deployment was officially framed as part of a counter-narcotics mission, but nobody was fooled by this diplomatic language. Counter-narcotics operations don't typically require the kind of firepower that was now positioned just off Venezuela's coast. This was the largest U.S. naval presence in the Caribbean in years, and everyone understood what it really represented: a show of force designed to demonstrate that America was serious about collecting on that $50 million bounty. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. Beyond the 3 destroyers, reports suggested the deployment included P-8 maritime patrol aircraft for surveillance, amphibious vessels, and possibly nuclear submarines. This wasn't a small-scale interdiction effort. This was the kind of naval task force typically assembled for major military operations. Anonymous sources within the Pentagon revealed the true scope of what was unfolding. Reuters reported that the 3 American ships deployed could arrive off the coast of Venezuela as early as Saturday, carrying 4,500 military service service members, including over 2,000 Marines. The inclusion of Marines was particularly significant. These aren't naval personnel designed for ship-to-ship combat, but rather ground troops trained for amphibious assault operations. The psychological impact of this deployment on Venezuela was immediate and profound. Venezuelan state television began running continuous coverage of the approaching American naval force, with anchors describing it as an imminent threat to national sovereignty. But more importantly, the deployment triggered a response from Maduro that revealed just how seriously he was taking the American threat. In a move that stunned international observers, Maduro announced what he called a special plan that would fundamentally transform Venezuela's defensive posture. Speaking on state television with the kind of urgency typically reserved for wartime addresses, Maduro declared his intention to mobilize the largest citizen militia in the history of the Western Hemisphere.
This week, I'm going to activate a special plan to ensure coverage with more than 4,500,000 militia members, across the entire national territory. Militias prepared, activated, and armed, rifles and missiles for the rural force to defend the territory, the sovereignty, and the peace of Venezuela.
4.5 million militia members. To put this number in perspective, this would represent approximately 18% of Venezuela's entire population of 28 million people. If Maduro's claims were accurate, he was essentially declaring that nearly 1 in 5 Venezuelans would take up arms against any American intervention. The announcement was accompanied by a massive propaganda campaign designed to rally Venezuelan citizens to the cause. Venezuelan state television began broadcasting recruitment appeals around the clock, with presenters declaring that when your country calls, it's as if your mother was calling. The rhetoric was deliberately emotional, designed to tap into deep wells of patriotism and anti-American sentiment that had been building for decades. But international military analysts immediately questioned whether Maduro's militia numbers were realistic. Independent estimates put Venezuela's total armed forces at somewhere between 100,000 to 400,000 personnel, with many ranks hollowed out by desertions amid the country's economic collapse. The idea that a country struggling to feed its own population could suddenly mobilize 4.5 million effective fighters seemed far-fetched to many experts. Despite these questions about the actual effectiveness of Maduro's militia, the announcement had its intended effect. It demonstrated that Venezuela was prepared to fight rather than surrender their president to American forces. The imagery of millions of armed Venezuelans preparing to defend their homeland created a powerful narrative that resonated not just within Venezuela, but throughout Latin America. The militia mobilization wasn't just about numbers, it was about transforming the entire social fabric of Venezuela into a defensive network. Maduro ordered militia members to be deployed into workplaces and factories, creating an armed presence throughout Venezuelan society. This wasn't traditional military organization. This was the militarization of civilian life on a scale rarely seen outside of wartime conditions. But Maduro's response went beyond just mobilizing militias within Venezuela's borders. In a move that threatened to destabilize the entire region, Venezuela announced that 15,000 regular troops would be stationed along its border with Colombia, particularly in the Zulia and Táchira states. This deployment was ostensibly to fight drug trafficking, but everyone understood the real message. Venezuela was preparing for the possibility that American forces might try to approach from multiple directions. The positioning of Venezuelan troops along the Colombian border was particularly provocative because Colombia has been a key U.S. ally in the region. By essentially militarizing this border, Maduro was forcing Colombia to choose sides in what was rapidly becoming a regional crisis. The move put enormous pressure on the Colombian government, which found itself caught between its alliance with the United States and its need to maintain stability along its Venezuelan border. As news of the militia mobilization spread, residents of Caracas found themselves grappling with the reality that their country might be on the verge of war with the world's most powerful military. Venezuelan television began broadcasting footage of citizens signing up for militia service, with long lines forming outside military recruitment centers. The atmosphere in the capital was a mixture of patriotic fervor and genuine fear about what might be coming.
While it is true that the United States Army is giant, there are also giants who are with us. There are the Russians and the Chinese who will support us at any moment.
The reference to Russian and Chinese support wasn't just empty rhetoric. Venezuela had spent years building strategic partnerships with America's primary geopolitical rivals, and this crisis was testing whether those partnerships would translate into actual military assistance. The involvement of Russia and China added a dangerous international dimension to what might otherwise have been a regional conflict. conflict. Not all Venezuelans were convinced that the American threat was real or that militarization was the right response. Many citizens, already struggling with daily survival in a collapsed economy, viewed the military buildup with skepticism. They had heard promises and threats from their government before, and many wondered whether this was just another attempt to distract from domestic problems. The regional reaction to the escalating crisis was swift and divided. Several Latin American and Caribbean countries, including Colombia and Cuba, condemned the U.S. naval deployment as a threat to regional peace and stability. However, other nations in the region quietly supported the American pressure campaign, viewing Maduro as a destabilizing force whose removal might benefit regional security. Trinidad and Tobago, located just 7 miles from Venezuela, publicly endorsed the U.S. naval deployment and offered to facilitate operations from its territory. This was a significant development because it gave the United States a staging area very close to Venezuelan territory, dramatically reducing the logistical challenges of any potential military operation. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reaffirmed Moscow's support for Maduro's government, adding another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. The prospect of Russian military advisors or equipment being deployed to Venezuela raised the specter of a Caribbean missile crisis reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. But as tensions reached a boiling point, with American warships closing in on Venezuelan waters and millions of Venezuelan militia members preparing for war, the most dramatic moments of this crisis were yet to come. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Nicolas Maduro, but the future of American power, projection in Latin America and beyond. A dictator's defiance, and the global stakes. As American warships approached Venezuelan territorial waters and millions of militia members prepared for potential invasion, the world held its breath waiting to see how far both sides were willing to push this unprecedented confrontation. What happened next revealed not just the desperation of a cornered dictator, but the complex web of global relationships that had transformed a regional dispute into a potential catalyst for wider international conflict. Nicolas Maduro's response to the $50 million bounty and the approaching American naval armada was characteristically defiant. In a televised address that was broadcast across Venezuela and picked up by international news networks, Maduro dared Trump to arrest him, warning that such an attempt would provoke powerful retaliation and potentially mark the end of the American empire. This wasn't the language of a leader seeking diplomatic solutions. This was the rhetoric of a man who believed he had nothing left to lose. But Maduro's defiance wasn't just empty bluster. Behind the scenes, Venezuelan intelligence services and military commanders were working frantically to transform their country into what military analysts call a porcupine defense, making any potential American invasion so costly and complicated that it would deter attack through sheer difficulty rather than conventional military strength. The reality of Venezuela's military situation was far more complex than Maduro's public statements suggested. While he claimed to have mobilized 4.5 million militia members, the true state of Venezuelan defenses painted a different picture. The country's economy had collapsed so completely that even basic military operations were becoming difficult to sustain. The stark contrast between Maduro's alleged personal wealth and his country's desperate poverty had become a central part of the American case against him. How does a leader accumulate $700 million in assets while his people suffer from 20-hour daily power outages and lack access to clean water? This question resonated not just with international audiences, but increasingly with Venezuelans themselves. This historical context made the current crisis even more tragic. Venezuela had once been one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America, with citizens who were internationally recognized for their optimism and quality of life. The transformation from prosperity to misery under socialist governance had created millions of refugees and internally displaced persons, fundamentally altering the demographics of the entire region. The human cost of Venezuela's collapse couldn't be separated from the geopolitical drama unfolding in the Caribbean. Over 7 million Venezuelans had fled their homeland, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern Latin American history. These weren't just statistics. They were families torn apart, professionals forced to abandon careers, elderly people separated from their children who had fled in search of basic necessities. The American argument for intervention wasn't just about narcotics trafficking or authoritarian governance. It was about stopping a humanitarian catastrophe that was destabilizing the entire region. From this perspective, the $50 million bounty wasn't just about capturing one man. It was about potentially saving millions of people from continued suffering under a failed regime. The American strategy appeared to be designed around avoiding direct military confrontation while maximizing pressure on Maduro's inner circle. The $50 million bounty wasn't just about external enemies. It was designed to create internal instability by making betrayal extremely lucrative for anyone close to the Venezuelan president.
You only need one of those destroyers, and we're sending 3. This is off the charts. Now then, There's a very important word that's in the middle of all this reporting, and that word is Chevron.
The involvement of American oil companies added another dimension to the crisis. Chevron and other major energy corporations had significant interests in Venezuela's vast oil reserves. Venezuela sits on some of the world's largest proven oil reserves, making it a strategic prize for any nation or company that could gain access to those resources. This revealed one of the fundamental tensions in American policy toward Venezuela. Was this really about human rights and democracy? Or was it about ensuring American companies could access Venezuelan oil resources? The involvement of major energy corporations in lobbying for intervention suggested that economic interests were playing at least as important a role as humanitarian concerns. The drug trafficking allegations against Maduro represented perhaps the most serious aspect of the American case. According to U.S. officials, Venezuela was responsible for approximately 25% of the world's cocaine production, making it a central player in the global narcotics trade that was devastating American communities. From this perspective, the $50 million bounty wasn't just about removing a dictator, it was about cutting off one of the primary sources of drugs flowing into the United States. The historical precedents for American intervention in Latin America also cast shadows over the current crisis. From Chile to Nicaragua to Panama, the United States had a long history of intervening in Latin American countries, often with mixed results for the local populations. Many Venezuelans who opposed Maduro were still wary of American intervention, fearing that it might replace one form of oppression with another.
So the bigger concern with this is if they allow them to continue, other Maduros in South and Central America are going to be like, oh, there is opportunity. America will allow somebody like me to be there. One, you got to get the oil to be circulating. The other one is you don't want another person to want to be like him. You don't want Mexico to be like him.
The domino theory was clearly influencing American strategic thinking. The concern wasn't just about Venezuela itself, but about the precedent that allowing Maduro to survive American pressure might set for other potential authoritarian leaders in the region. If Venezuela could successfully resist the United States through a combination of militia mobilization, international partnerships, and economic diversification, other nations might attempt similar strategies. Mexico represented a particularly sensitive case study in this regard. The country was already dealing with significant cartel influence over government operations, and American policymakers worried that a successful Venezuelan resistance to U.S. pressure might embolden Mexican cartels to push for even greater political control. Iran's involvement in the Venezuelan situation added yet another layer of complexity. The Islamic Republic had its own reasons for supporting Maduro, including shared opposition to American sanctions and a mutual interest in developing alternative economic systems that could operate independently of Western financial institutions. Venezuelan oil could help Iran circumvent American sanctions, while Iranian technical expertise could help Venezuela maintain its energy infrastructure despite international isolation. The Cuban connection was particularly significant, given the island nation's long history of resistance to American pressure. Cuba had successfully maintained its socialist system for over 6 decades, despite being just 90 miles from the Florida coast. Venezuelan leaders had studied Cuban survival strategies extensively, and many of Maduro's defensive preparations appeared to be based on Cuban models of resistance. This analysis of Venezuela's international relationships highlighted one of the fundamental challenges facing American policy in the region. Venezuela had successfully diversified its international partnerships to the point where American economic pressure, while significant, was no longer existentially threatening to the regime. The days when the United States could single-handedly determine the fate of Latin American governments through economic sanctions appeared to be ending. The Venezuelan crisis was unfolding against the backdrop of a broader transformation in global power relationships. The unipolar moment that had followed the end of the Cold War, when the United States enjoyed unchallenged global dominance, was clearly coming to an end. Countries like Venezuela represented test cases for whether American power could still decisively shape outcomes in regions that had traditionally been considered part of the American sphere of influence. The economic implications of the crisis extended far beyond Venezuela's borders. Oil markets were already volatile due to various global tensions, and the prospect of Venezuelan oil supplies being disrupted by military conflict created additional uncertainty. Venezuela's status as a member of OPEC meant that any disruption to its oil production could have global implications for energy prices.
What international oil group is Venezuela a part of? And everybody forgets about it.
OPEC?
Correct.
Thanks,
They
Tom.
are the lone OPEC representative in the other hemisphere. And they went to OPEC so that they could get pricing controls and other things because they didn't have a working government to help. And so right now, Maduro is just out there.
The OPEC dimension added another layer of international complexity to the crisis. Other OPEC members had varying degrees of sympathy for Venezuela's situation, but they also had practical concerns about how instability in Venezuela might affect global oil markets and their own economic interests. As the standoff intensified, with American warships positioned off Venezuelan waters and millions of militia members mobilized throughout the country, the world watched to see whether this would become the first major military confrontation of what many observers were beginning to call a new era of great power competition. The stakes for both sides were enormous. For the United States, success in removing Maduro would demonstrate that American power remained decisive in the Western Hemisphere despite the changing global balance of power. Failure, however, would likely embolden other adversaries and accelerate the transition to a multipolar world order where American influence was more limited. For Maduro, survival would validate his strategy of resistance through international partnerships and domestic mobilization. It would prove that small countries could successfully resist American pressure if they were willing to pay the necessary costs in terms of international isolation and domestic hardship. For the Venezuelan people, the outcome would determine whether they would continue to live under the current system, face the uncertainties of American intervention, or potentially see some form of negotiated transition that might offer hope for improvement without the trauma of military conflict. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.